Okay. Well, welcome everyone, and again, thank you for joining us. Really excited today to have two of the leading scientific voices in the restoration and reforestation community here to join us to talk about conservation, to talk about restoration, to talk about biodiversity, to talk about albedo and some really cool things that maybe we aren't in our normal day-to-day lexicon. But we are in wonderful hands with Susan Cook-Patton and Tom Crowther. Susan is a senior forest restoration scientist on the National Climate Solutions team at the Nature Conservancy. She works to quantify the climate mitigation potential of reforestation and other natural climate solutions and infuse the best available science into policy decisions. She has over a decade of experience leading scientific investigations into how changes in biodiversity and climate are impacting forests, grassland, and urban ecosystems. And before joining TNC, she was a policy fellow at the Forest Service, research fellow at the Smithsonian, and Susan has her PhD from Cornell, and a bachelor's degree from the Indiana University. So I'm a Big Ten person. So nice. I'm glad to see that, Susan. Susan's friend, who has graciously agreed to join us from Zurich, Tom Crowther, is and on a Swiss holiday nonetheless. So this is how important Tom sees this work. So Tom, thank you so much for your time today. Tom is a Welsh scientist studying ecology and global biodiversity. He's assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Systems Science, where he founded Crowther Lab, an interdisciplinary group of scientists studying global ecosystems to facilitate local efforts to protect, restore, and manage biodiversity around the world. Tom serves as co-chair of the advisory board of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and his research focuses on understanding the fundamental forces that shape ecological communities within and across ecosystems. So we'll put links to their bios in the chat because there's so much more to learn. We are truly lucky to have both of these gifted scientists with us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin. And yeah, it is really exciting to be here to be presenting to you guys. It's a community and a world that I think this scientific information needs to pervade into to have the impact we're all looking for. I'm going to kick off with a quote, as I always do. Stephen Wright said that to steal ideas from one person is plagiarism, and in science that's a pretty intense thing. But when we steal idea from loads of people, that's actually okay. That's actually just the scientific process. And I think this is a bit of a guiding principle in what I want to communicate today, because science isn't just about having big ideas or good ideas. It's more about building consensus around those ideas so that society can have the foothold to move forward. And I think that's a little bit of a guiding principle in our research. In our group, we pull together data sets from scientists all across the planet. And by doing that, we start to build a consensus understanding of global biodiversity and how it interacts with the climate and how we can manage biodiversity across the globe. And possibly one of our more controversial, in fact, definitely our most controversial work, has focused on this, the global forest system. This magnificent, massive scale of a system has incredible insights to tell us about our world and how it functions. And a few years ago, I guess in 2015, we mapped the density of the forests across the world, showing that our Earth is home to just over 3 trillion trees. This was a pretty big moment in the media. Definitely got a lot of positive and constructive feedback. We were infuriated some people who said that we missed the trees in the Vatican City. It gives you a bit of an insight into the scale of uncertainty in these kinds of models. So we had to update our model, but 3 trillion and 12 is still a massive number of trees that we have on our planet. And it sort of gave us the foundation for building these kind of models that we could start to assess not only where trees exist now, but we could also run them in a world where humans don't exist to evaluate where trees can naturally grow. And that the word naturally is quite a key point there. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So we were able to see where forests would naturally be in the absence of human activity. And once we have this, we now have the insight to be able to remove urban and agricultural lands. And also we could remove the existing forests to show us where trees might naturally be growing if humans in the degraded or the sort of the low human footprint parts of the world, if we weren't managing them quite so intensively, what the potential might be. And what was pretty astonishing at the time is that was the first study that revealed that the Earth does have that capacity for about 1 trillion new trees, which was just that. I think the alliteration captured a lot of attention, but it went even more insane when we realized that those forests could capture about 205 gigatons of carbon. That's about 1/3 of our climate change needs. And when that information combined with this incredible alliteration happened, suddenly it went bonkers. It was insane. I don't know how many of you remember, but back in 2019, I was definitely in a tumble dryer of media engagement around the topic of trees. I think it reached about 60 million people in the first day, and it just exploded after that. And it gave rise to many things like the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. This decade was called the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. WWF launched their Trillion Trees campaign, and shortly afterwards, the World Economic Forum, as we all know, initiated the 1T.org initiative, which is now probably the most biggest and most direct initiative driving massive scale ecological restoration. And as this message started to pervade into the sort of political landscape, many governments and companies were pledging commitment with the right mission behind, right mission in mind to promote biodiversity and the well-being of people who depend on it. But many others also, and I didn't mean the timing of this wasn't me intending to focus only on Trump, but many others saw this as an opportunity to essentially greenwash, to just buy up swaths of land and plant rows of carbon, rows of trees that are essentially built to capture carbon and nothing else. Now, this is obviously pretty devastating for the climate change movement because it gave rise to this idea that we could just offset our emissions by planting a few trees. And this was a very damaging message. It was also damaging for the biodiversity movement because these carbon farms they're often blanketed at the expense of all the biodiversity that we depend on. And it gave rise to a period of academic controversy that I think undermined the environmental movement for quite some time. Personally, it was a very, very dark time, a bit of a dark space. We were criticized heavily. People said there's no way forests could capture 200 gigatons of carbon. It was a highly controversial and hot topic, and it was a difficult moment. And it gave rise to media headlines that I think have exasperated the problem. And to some extent, they still persist today. There's a lot of talk. Rather than focusing on the unbelievable power of nature and the potential of natural ecosystems, I think it's more flashy to highlight the risks of restoration done wrong. And look, these headlines are absolutely correct. There is not a scientist in the world who would disagree with the fact that the wrong trees in the wrong place will do more harm than good. Now, that is fundamentally correct. But it's also absolutely overwhelmingly obvious, and this sentence applies to literally everything that has ever existed. If you stick a toothbrush in the wrong place, it can do a lot more harm than good. And that applies to everything we've ever managed, particularly the natural world. But it's also quite concerning because it's arguments like this that have given rise to this idea, this sort of contest between nature and climate. There's many people, in fact, even scientists out there, who would argue that we shouldn't be focusing on nature because it's a distraction from our efforts to cut emissions. And that is where I think the polarizing nature of this conversation has been a bit of a challenge. So to tackle that, rather than fighting back against headlines like this, many ecologists across the globe, including Susan and myself, have all been collaborating. And this was the study I'm introducing now was a collaboration from over 300 scientists pulling together data from millions of locations across the planet. And what we were trying to do is essentially revisit those numbers, revisit that science that we did in 2019 to get a more comprehensive understanding of the potential. With that massive amount of data and the incredible amount of approaches and insights of those hundreds and hundreds of scientists, we could start to build a more robust understanding. By pairing the satellite observations with the ground source data, we were able to actually show that we weren't overestimating in 2019. In fact, we were slightly underestimating the staggering potential of global forests to capture carbon. And this number was beautifully aligned with several of the other studies that have recently been conducted on this same topic, showing that we are building towards this really consensus understanding. But this time it was much more exciting because we could not only show what the potential is, we could show how it could be achieved. We have much more data and much more rich information. And that showed us, of course, that the power of nature is in its complexity, where every species depends on others to survive. And that means natural diverse forests capture more than 50% more carbon than individual monocultures of the same species. So the simple message from this is, yes, diverse forests can categorically help us with a third of our climate goals. But this will only happen if we also cut emissions. And I want to stress the word also, because so many times this has been an either or conversation when categorically we have no place for an or in this space. It is, we need emissions cuts and we need nature, because if we don't continue to cut emissions, fires, floods, droughts are only going to deplete the potential of global forests further. There can be no dispute between the two. And this time the headlines came out absolutely right. And I couldn't have been more happy. And on top of that, I was even happier about the scientific feedback. People said it provided clarity and confidence in the media. They said the take-home messages were foundational and correct. And even our harshest critic from 2019, someone who I now collaborate a lot with, described, sort of summarized the work of 350 scientists over 4 years as reasonable, which is by far the best feedback I've ever received in my life, and a big victory for the group. And I think what was really nice, and I'm going to leave it here to pass on to Susan, what was really nice for us at this time is that we got feedback not only from the other scientists and the media, but it was from the politicians who now said, you know, I got contacted by my colleagues in the EU restoration law in Brussels, who said that it's not the findings, but it's the consensus building among scientists that gave them the confidence and the platform to really move forward in a lot of the discussions around the EU restoration law. And I think it's this consensus building that's happening across the globe, this growing appreciation for the fundamental need for nature that is really starting to give momentum to lots of conservation and restoration initiatives. I'll just leave on the fact that I do have to mention that the EU restoration law is currently on its knees because of people who are concerned that nature will come at the expense of their jobs, of the food production that we need, of our livelihoods. And those concerns are genuine and understandable, but they are also coming from a place of fear that nature does come at the expense, that there's a trade-off between nature and people. And that is the place I think that we most critically need this consensus building now, because there is absolutely every piece of scientific evidence from the last century around this topic would point to exactly the opposite. In fact, there's been 11 previous civilizations that have collapsed as a result of the loss of nature. If we lose our forests if we lose the Amazon rainforest, we lose food production in North and South America. In no location on the planet is a degraded ecosystem more valuable than a beautiful, flourishing one. And so it's critical that we get this message across, this science-based message across, that we need nature for every aspect of our survival. And I'll hand over to Susan, or back to Kevin, maybe.
Brilliant, thanks, Tom. And yeah, we'll allow Susan to do her screen sharing and add some additional context to the conversation from her fine research. Susan, turn it over to you.
Great. Well, I'm very glad to follow Tom, because I think he did a great job of setting the stage for why there's so much enthusiasm around nature-based solutions for climate. And now I'm going to spend some of the time that I have with you talking about how do we get those big numbers and get it down to actual on-the-ground implementation, because we can't do everything everywhere. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough resources. We don't have enough tree seedlings to massively scale up across the globe. And so how can we figure out the places where we get the best returns per acre of investment, per dollar of investment? So I work on natural climate solutions, which are all the different ways that you can reduce emissions or capture additional carbon from the land sector. And you can do that through improved management, protection, or restoration of agricultural lands, wetlands, forests, and grasslands. But I wanted to start, and this is a message that Tom reiterated as well, that we need all climate solutions. It's really not helpful to have a debate about like this or that. If it's a viable climate solution, we should deploy it. And I'll say that I'm very grateful that I get to be the one talking to you all today. But I hope that those out there listening feel empowered to pick their favorite climate solution and lean in and make it happen, because the only way we're going to tackle the climate crisis is if we all push together from multiple fronts. So obviously reducing fossil fuel emissions is paramount, but then I put this picture up because I feel like there's a very strong emphasis on removals only, and I work on removals. I love removals, But it's important to remember that we also need to reduce emissions from the land sector. So if the atmosphere is a bathtub and it's overflowing, what is the first action that a reasonable person would do? They would turn off the spigot, right? You would reduce the flow into the atmosphere, into the bathtub, and then you would pull the plug, which is what removals are. So let's not lose the protection of land and reducing emissions in our enthusiasm for removals. And I was very glad that the little blurb for this talk mentioned the NCS hierarchy, which was a paper that we put together a few years ago to really counter this removals only focus. Because if you are thinking about the cost effectiveness, how much mitigation can you get per dollar of investment? If you're thinking about the time horizon, how rapidly can you achieve that climate mitigation? If you're thinking about the biodiversity value, how many different species and how much habitat can you support? And if you're thinking about sort of the flux density, which is just like how much mitigation can you get per acre, protect actions generally achieve much higher along all of those metrics than restore. So that I just wanted to start with that, and then I'll switch to restoration and removals, which is my own personal focus, but wanted to lodge that in your mind as a start. So talking about natural climate solutions for the United States, this was a paper that came out in 2018 that Joe Fargione led with many people across the country. And what that paper found was that reforestation was the single largest opportunity within the US. But it was a fairly simplistic approach for trying to define where opportunity actually is. So it was basically these three questions that Tom actually alluded to earlier. Is it ecologically appropriate for trees, for forest? Is it not currently a forest, so you can put additional trees? And is it not a city, a road, or good agricultural land, somewhere that humans need? So check, 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 great. That is now opportunity. And you come up with a big number, that's 307 teragrams of CO2 per year across 156 million acres. But then when you look at individual pixels, you're like, well, that is sort of, maybe abandoned looking agricultural land, that could be viable. That's a power line right away, like maybe, like that's a golf course, maybe not. I'm terrible at golf. I would turn them back into forests, but I think there's many in the world that would want to protect their golf courses. So what we wanted to do is actually break that big number down into more of a menu. So like you go to a restaurant, you look at the menu and you say, okay, these are the types of options that would work for me, given where I am, my local context. And these types of places, no, like we don't want to reforest those, as well as make all of our data publicly available so that we could accelerate custom analysis at more local levels. This was the menu that we came up with. We tried to focus on places that we thought were lower hanging fruit or more feasible options for reforestation in the US. The first was something that's already in a natural land. So it's currently a grassland, a shrubland, or within a federal or state or local protected area, but lacks forest cover. Then our next category were things that humans are using, but it's potentially a lower value. So agricultural lands that have challenging soil conditions that really limit how much production can happen in those places. And we also looked at places that are frequently flooding. So they experience a flood event every 5 years right now. And with the rise of extreme weather events under climate change, potentially those places are becoming even less viable for production or human land use. And then the last category were places that provide high ecosystem services to people beyond just carbon storage. So also those frequently flooded landscapes, because upstream trees can help protect downstream communities during flood events. Riparian areas. So for example, if it's in an agricultural land, a lot of the fertilizer runoff can get captured by the trees and not wind up in the waterways. As well as urban areas, we know that trees can help to keep us cool in the summer and warm in the winter when they're in urban areas. And then places that foster climate resilience as a way to help support biodiversity. And the exercise here was basically a very large GIS combination. And I'm showing you the details here, but what you need to know is first, we tried to figure out where are the places where greater than 25% tree cover is appropriate. And that sets the largest area. And then we removed the locations that are not appropriate for additional trees. So current forests, places that have perennial ice and snow, fast roads, wilderness areas where you can't actually do anything, and then good cropland. But then the most important thing is, you're left with the biophysical suitable area for reforestation. But what we want is for people to then choose from that area. What are the places where they want to focus? And just to give you a sense of what some of these look like, this is a protected area opportunity in the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, probably a post-burn landscape. Here is something that had lower value. These were marginal soil conditions in agricultural landscapes. And then potentially, you know, your own backyard. You might want to let trees grow there, which is what I'm doing in my tiny little postage stamp of a backyard. We published it in a paper, which is great. It's nice to have the paper out there to document the methods, but even more importantly, we were able to work with American Forest to build it into a web tool, which is called the Reforestation Hub, which allows people to play with the data. And we frequently update, we update it about once a year with the latest and greatest science. I think our last update was in May or March of last year. And what we found is that there are up to 148 million hectares of opportunity in the US. And that would take a lot of trees to reforest those whole areas, and it could capture a lot of CO2, equivalent to 116 million years, or sorry, 116 million cars from the road. But what I most like about this, rather than the big number, is it really helps you to explore where those opportunities are and what sort of levers you're trying to change. So for example, you look at total opportunity and the Eastern US really lights up. So that suggests that, you know, maybe we should be focusing on the US. But if you click on the menu option, you can get to federal opportunity, and that is in the West. So if you were interested in trying to work with federal entities to try to scale up reforestation, you should be focusing in the West. Whereas if you are interested in working with private landowners, that's going to be much more of an Eastern story. And you can drill down further. So you can click on an individual state, even an individual county, and it gives you the opportunity. So this is the county I live in Maryland, where urban open space and pasture are the two biggest opportunities within that county. And you can then go even further and drill down. But what I wanted to point out for this one is that we have resources also available about how to plant the trees, how to grow the trees, things that are specific to your state, as well as access to the raw data, which a lot of people have used to really build those custom analyses to figure out what are the places that are right for them for reforestation in the US. So with that, I don't have a good transition, but that was sort of foundational research. And then I wanted to share some of our most recent research, which is really, again, about trying to find those places where you can get the best returns per dollar of investment, per acre of investment. And this has to do with, oh, we just lost power. Can you still hear me? Or did I maybe didn't move enough. Where we looked at albedo. So albedo, for those of you that don't know, is the fraction of sunlight that is absorbed by the land surface versus reflected back into space. And you all have a sense of this, right? If you go outside in the summer and you're wearing a black shirt versus a white shirt, you get a lot hotter in the black shirt. And that happens with the land surface too. If it's a darker surface, less sunlight is reflected back into space and it causes warming. Your shirt, you're experiencing local warming, but then you can actually, through very complicated math, figure out what that is at a planetary scale as far as how it impacts global warming, which is what we're talking about today. And Tom was one of our collaborators on this paper, so he can help answer questions too. So generally, forests are darker than the land surfaces that they replace. So if you have a grassland and you turn it back into a forest, that will cause some degree of warming due to changes in albedo. But those changes in albedo, that's only part of the story. You really also have to think about changes in carbon. So for the first thing that we're looking at here on the left, you have somewhere where reforestation potentially captures a lot of carbon and only has a fairly small change in albedo. And the net difference between those leaves a very large net climate benefit. You can have a location with the same albedo change, but a smaller change in carbon due to reforestation. And then you would get an overall smaller climate benefit. But there are also places where the same amount of carbon is what we have in the middle, but a much larger change in albedo, and it can entirely overwhelm that cooling that you get from carbon storage. And so these are the places where we don't actually want to reforest locations for climate benefits. There's lots of other reasons why we might want to put trees back. But if you're thinking exclusively about climate, we really want to avoid those net negative climate locations because we're going to make climate change worse. And just to explain the methods a little bit, we used well-established albedo data that has been around for a long time. We just took it and turned it into a more useful form for folks. So the first step was to take the albedo atlas that accounts for places that vary in things like snow cover, and account for that variation. The next step was to figure out how albedo would change for a given land cover transition. So that accounts for reforestation happening. You're going from an open land to a forested land. The next step is to then take albedo at the surface level and turn it into that top of atmosphere globally relevant measure. So that figures out the planetary warming effect. And then lastly, convert that into carbon dioxide equivalents, because nobody can think in radiative forcing, but CO2 equivalents, it makes it much easier to compare against carbon storage. And we consider 4 different starting conditions: shrublands, grasslands, croplands, or a mosaic, and then 6 different forest types. So 4 times 6, it gives you 24 different maps. And then we have minimum and maximum values for those to try to capture the uncertainty. And those are all available, and they're good if you're thinking at sort of the project level and you know what your initial land cover is. You're like, okay, I'm starting with an open shrubland. You know your final land cover, you're going for an evergreen needle leaf forest as an example. There's a layer for you. This is the open shrubland to evergreen forest layer. And then you can compare that against your expected carbon storage and figure out how much is albedo going to change your net climate benefit. But we also realize that a lot of people don't want to have to deal with 24 times 3 different maps, a lot to handle when you're just trying to make decisions. And so what we did is we built a single layer where we used a data-driven approach to figure out the most likely transition. So most likely open land for any given spot on the globe and most likely end state. And this is what you come up with. So you'll see that most of it is orange, which is just an indication that albedo change generally causes warming from reforestation, but there are a few blue spots in there where albedo actually augments the climate benefit. Those are primarily in the tropics. But as I said before, albedo is only part of the story. You also have to think about carbon storage. Carbon storage is cooling. It's all blue because it's pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and locking it into long-lived carbon stores. And when you put them together, this is the net climate impact map. So there's several take-home messages here. There are places where you can put trees that are going to lead to negative climate outcomes. Many of those places are locations where you probably wouldn't want to put trees anyway, like native grasslands that we want to try to protect as grasslands. The other thing is that often people had very simplistic understanding of where albedo was a problem. It used to be like the boreal, don't do the boreal, you know, there be albedo dragons in the boreal. But our research shows that it's much more nuanced patterns across the landscape that really shows the value of a spatially explicit map. And the other good thing is that I was a little nervous when we were doing this analysis because we're like, okay, nobody's had an albedo map before. We've been doing restoration across a lot of parts of the globe. Like, how are we doing? And what we found was actually more than 80% of on-the-ground restoration projects are already concentrated in these climate positive locations. And I should say, thanks to the Restore database that Tom's group leads, we were really able to show this. Without something like Restore, that just wasn't possible before. So that's good, either due to good planning or luck. Restoration initiatives around the world are already concentrated in these climate positive zones. And just since this is a US-centric talk, I just thought I would end by showing what the map looks like for the US. So really great opportunity in the Pacific Northwest. You've got very high carbon storage forests there, as well as a lot in the Eastern US, but also opportunities scattered in other parts. And it does confirm the don't put trees in native prairies message that we've heard from many people. So with that, I'll hand it back to Tom, but I just wanted to leave a few key take-homes, which is that we need all climate solutions. Definitely reduction of fossil fuels, but also reduce land emissions and increase removal. So we're not trying to pick one option here. Let's try to push forward on all of them. Reforestation, even as we sort of have research coming out that hones the opportunity and sort of shrinks the big number a little bit, it still remains one of the most promising removal solutions that we have. Nothing else is as scalable or cost effective. And we're trying to create the tools that help people find the places where you can get the greatest mitigation potential per acre of investment. And also not to criticize the restoration and reforestation movement writ large. If they fall in a place where there's little to no climate mitigation, there's still an opportunity for those efforts to provide immense benefits to people and nature, just not carbon or climate mitigation, but there's still many other benefits. So it's not to criticize reforestation writ large, but help prioritize places where we should act. So with that, I will turn it back to Tom.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Susan. Again, perfect framing for where I'm planning to take this last bit of context. Because as Susan mentioned, we've talked so much about the climate benefits, and the climate benefits are wonderful, but they are really just one piece. And almost, you might argue, I would argue, they are the sort of co-benefit. They are the additional benefit to the real focus of bringing back nature, which is life on our planet, including humans. Without biodiversity on our planet, what's the point? Biodiversity is what allows us to survive. It is what transformed our planet from a barren volcanic rock into a livable utopia. And that is biodiversity and the well-being of people is the sort of primary focus of this. And as a byproduct, we can do amazing things for the climate. But I want to just sort of, again, reiterate what we're talking about when we mean global restoration or conservation. It's absolutely foundationally around protecting what we have. And as Susan mentioned, the biggest bang for your buck can actually be achieved by protecting. We found exactly the same thing in that study that I mentioned earlier. We estimated around 61% of the carbon drawdown potential we have in forests is by protecting the ecosystems we have now and allowing them to grow to maturity. And then the rest can also be achieved by restoration. And what we mean by restoration is not buy up land and bang trees there. It means revitalize the ecological integrity. So it means bringing back the microbes that are critical for any ecological restoration process. And we actually published a study just a couple of years ago showing, on average across the globe, when healthy microbes are present in a degraded soil, vegetation will recover about 64% faster on average. It can get a lot faster than that too. The same is true for animals. We can't be doing this without the vectors. These are the things that move spores and nutrients and seeds about. And we've recently, 2 weeks ago, published a study showing that actually when we have large animals, the potential for carbon capture in fragmented forest is 38% higher. But obviously, by far the most important component of this ecosystem is the people. And I stress this because if people don't want nature to recover, it won't, and it shouldn't do so. Nature is the thing that sustains us. It is the thing that provides our opportunities, but it's an interrelationship between people and nature that allows our systems to be sustainable. And this is the key. It's like really when I personally had those hard experiences in 2019, it was because people understood restoration to mean buying up land and planting trees, when in reality, it's about finding the millions of local landowners, the indigenous populations, the farmers, the local communities who are already the stewards of nature across the planet. And it's about distributing the wealth of our planet equitably towards those people. And this brings me to the tool that Susan mentioned. Restore this is the vision and the mission of Restore. And in fact, Susan's one of our advisory board members for exactly this reason. It's about bringing visibility to the world's restoration initiatives. And what we mean by that is the bottom-up ones. It's the local landowners, it's the farmers, the indigenous populations who have never been, for whom it's so difficult to become a part of our market space or the global environment that shapes things. And what we desperately need to do is find these people and distribute all of our energy towards them so that they can find the opportunities that make nature the sustainable option. So what Restore means is you can, in any location on the planet, draw around any shape, where it's your garden or your back or a forest nearby, gives you data on the species that are there or that could be there, the carbon and the water that's happening in that region. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. This is Desta's coffee jungle, one of my favorite examples in Ethiopia. You can see the massive footprint of deforestation in the Kaffa region. But as you zoom into Desta's, you see that footprint is quite different, because actually instead of removing the forest, they are keeping the forest intact and planting coffee trees underneath the canopy, which traps water and nutrients, which means Desta's coffee actually grows really well without the need for fertilizers or irrigation. And as a result of that, all the farmers in the nearby area are allowing trees to recover on their farms so that they can have more effective, more efficient, and more productive coffee production. On Restore, Desta gets free information about the species that grow there, as I mentioned, about the carbon and the water, but by far the most valuable thing to him is that he gets visibility to his customers. So now when you go and buy a product from him, you can see immediately that when you're buying that product, you're not only avoiding a negative footprint, you're having a positive footprint on the planet. And that's what brings his customers back more and more and more. He tells me people repeatedly say that they'll never go back to Starbucks because they now know that they're having a positive impact. There's no shame on Starbucks, but we'd love Starbucks to start using this too, so we can start to give agency to customers so that we can choose which coffee we want to buy based on the impact that it can have. And obviously, I'm going to skip that. The real value, though, of Restore, or the other value of Restore, is that it also allows those incredible landowners they are generating information that informs us about the state of the global movement. And as Susan mentioned, her study was the first actually to use the Restore database to show the cooling and warming impacts of these restoration projects all across the globe, which is a mind-blowing discovery that actually these projects are located primarily in regions where they're having a tangible cooling impact on the planet. Now, that's not to say that they shouldn't proceed if they're having a warming impact, because those impacts could be just as important for biodiversity and human well-being. But it's incredible that we now have the tools to be able to study the state of global restoration. And that's the story I'm going to sort of leave on, because now Restore is being used as a tool by the FAO to track all of the government's commitments to the biodiversity targets, so that those biodiversity targets were agreed in Montreal 2 years ago. And we are now using, Restore is being used by those countries to track how they're doing in moving towards that biodiversity progress. And one really awesome example is Costa Rica. And I'm sure many of you have heard or know of the story of Costa Rica because it is the flagship example of national scale restoration. 28 years ago, the country, like many other regions in Central America, was down to about 20% to 25% tree cover because the forest had been removed primarily for meat production. And what the government did is, instead of business as usual, they actually abolished the army and they distributed the wealth of the planet to education, and they distributed the wealth to landowners, to local farmers, to partially compensate them for bringing back nature at the expense of their agricultural productivity, but also just to distribute wealth so that they can build that emotional and that physical connection between people and nature. And they distributed that to thousands and thousands of landowners across the country, which is, we can now monitor the incredible increases in carbon and vegetation cover and tree cover. But their exemplary levels of transparency in the process has been a game-changing moment for us as scientists, because now we can start to measure their health in a different way. What you're hearing is the sounds of a natural intact forest in Costa Rica. This is how an intact forest sounds in the absence. This is the sound of the average protected forest that has never been removed. And to a scientist, that looks like this. We can see the variation in frequencies across the day with various different high and low frequency sounds. Now, 27 years ago, the country would have sounded more like this. This is the average soundscape of a pasture where the forest has been removed. Now, you still hear the sounds of birds and insects, but what you're obviously lacking is that variation in frequencies where different species will fill different niches, as we're so familiar with in a natural ecosystem. And what's incredible is, as a result of their payment for ecosystem service program, all those thousands and thousands of sites that have been where money was distributed to local landowners now sounds more like this. So this is the average soundscape of a payment for ecosystem service site across the country, and it shows a staggering 86% recovery of the ecological integrity of that system. But what you're hearing there is actually the sound of howler monkeys. And to have howler monkeys returning into an ecosystem that was previously degraded is astonishing, because that will only happen if you have lots of food and nutrients and resources enough to support such a large and incredible mammal. And that means that someone on this planet has been responsible for the recovery, not only of this spectacular soundscape, but the recovery of biodiversity that is so critical to our survival. And what's really cool about this story, I think, is that we've also correlated these sounds with the sounds of music. So we can show statistically, when we download the top 1,000 most frequently downloaded songs in history, they sound statistically much closer to the sounds of nature than they do to the sounds of the degraded pasture. And that, now you could say that's a random correlation, because the sound of nature has a lot more variation in frequencies. But you could also argue that some of our best musicians on the planet have tapped into a deep connection that we all have with nature. We evolved in these ecosystems where the different sounds and frequencies indicate the possibility of foods and resources and medicines that we all need to survive. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that that our best artists are tapping into that to identify our musical preferences, to lean into them, to sort of figure out what it is that we prefer. And you might argue that this is ultimately evidence that Costa Rica is objectively getting more beautiful over time. Now, the really cool thing about this story for me is not the music, but it's the connection to Costa Rica's economy, because all of this happened at a time of economic growth and stability for the country. And now there could be many reasons for this, but I've actually spoken to the Minister for Finance in Costa Rica, and he says that there's no hint of spurious correlation here. He is categorically convinced that this is a causal relationship, because as the identity of the identity of people within the country got closer and closer to nature, so the economy started to grow. And just like Desta's coffee that I showed you earlier, or thousands of the other projects that I was discussing on the Restore Network, this, I think, is a national scale evidence of how nature can become the economic preference. And when that happens, just like the farmers around Desta's farm, you can't stop nature from recovering once it becomes once it feeds into the identity and the preference of the people living there. This, for us, this collaboration with Costa Rica was enabled because of Prince William's Earthshot Prize. They connected us, and now Prince William is trying to do exactly the same thing to encourage all the other governments around the world to distribute wealth in exactly the same way, because it's sort of finally becoming clearer and clearer that global restoration is not an environmental challenge, it's really a social challenge. If we can find and empower and distribute our wealth to the local land stewards of nature all across our planet, that is when we have the opportunity, well, then they have the opportunity to find the sustainable options that make nature the preference. And that's when people and nature have the best chance of thriving together. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Susan. I think a phenomenal a crash course, a crash master's course in all of the different challenges and opportunities I think we have in identifying this, from the suite, from planning to implementation, to design, to MMRV and monitoring, how much is going on. So thank you both for your time and for your phenomenal presentations. We have a few questions in the chat that I'm gonna start with, and if folks have other questions, please feel free to weigh in. But I'm gonna start with Susan. Two questions for you. One, how is time treated in the carbon removal local heating albedo trade-off? If carbon removal to temperature impact is in the future, while albedo is today, and also is evapotranspiration included in the reforestation benefits? And somewhat related, when determining most likely restoration opportunities, what climate scenarios did you look at? So.
Great. Yes, those are excellent questions. So in the paper that Natalia Hasler and Chris Williams at Clark led, we deliberately used maximum carbon storage and maximum albedo change because we actually don't have a good understanding of how rapidly albedo changes. We do know that albedo changes more rapidly than carbon because the full albedo effect or change occurs really when you sort of reach full canopy closure. And once that happens, you're still building up a lot of carbon in those systems as they get denser and more complex through time. So the albedo change will happen more rapidly than the carbon change. There was a question about sort of local cooling versus global warming. And that is a bit of a brain bender where it's quite possible to put trees into an urban area and experience a lot of local cooling because of things like evapotranspiration, where trees are releasing water into the air, because of things like shading. But at the same time, those same trees could have global warming outcomes. So this is where, it's wonderful when we can have a project that maximizes outcomes like on all potential metrics, but often we have a specific outcome that we want in mind. If it's adaptation and trying to help protect people due to increasing warm, extreme heat events, then you probably would want a lot more trees around where people are. Whereas if you're focusing just on carbon storage, you are going to want to focus on those net climate positive locations. And then let's see, was there one more? Oh, climate futures. We are not actually yet taking into account future climate scenarios. Our work is based off of empirically derived field data, and that's the next frontier, is to build in climate models. I will say, as the climate warms, I don't expect our albedo maps to, there are not going to be more places that become blue. The places where you're going to get shifts in forest types towards more grassland or open ecosystems, those are going to be already places that sort of are looking more net climate negative. So it's going to sort of tighten the locations where it makes the most sense to act for climate mitigation.
Brilliant, thank you. And I love to focus on the outcomes. Like there's so many different positive outcomes that forests and trees can play in different places. So thinking through strategically about what your outcomes are critical. I think we have time for a couple more, so this is great. This is for both of you, from Eric Wilburn. Kind of a wonky question he cites, but one of the primary challenges to increasing investment into natural climate solutions is the permanence critique. What do you think is the best approach to accounting for the reality that NCS often can't guarantee 1,000-year permanence, but are critical to at least a near-term climate mitigation, not to mention the co-benefits beyond? So talk about permanence.
Want to go first, Tom? Since I spoke, I'm happy to jump in.
Sure. I guess this is a question where I think I'm really naive, because every time I get asked it, I am only talking from a scientific perspective and not a practical one. But from a scientific perspective, I find this insane. I find it absurd that forests are not a particularly permanent, considered a permanent climate solution. The Amazon rainforest has been storing hundreds of gigatons of carbon for millions of years. Does that count as permanent? Conserving the Amazon rainforest feels pretty permanent to me, but I do recognize that an individual tree can come and go. But if we're talking about sustaining or managing and supporting systems, the coming and going of individual trees has no relevance whatsoever. Now, I do agree, of course, fires and droughts and things are increasingly threatening our ecosystems, and so you can't ever guarantee an ecosystem is going to be sustainable. But if we're talking about sort of what I see as restoration, which is millions of local landowners being empowered to bring back nature, then the system has massive potential for permanence. But yeah, I realize, again, that's not a very satisfying answer, because it doesn't help you with one individual plot. And I do recognize that is a challenge and a problem that we're always going to have to face in the conversation. But speaking as a scientist, I find it annoying. It's ridiculous.
And totally agree with that. The other two things I would add is the climate crisis is here and now, and we need to deploy the solutions that are going to work. And so if a forest is not there 1,000 years from now, like, imagine how much of human history has changed in 1,000 years. Concerns about durability should not prevent us from deploying solutions that work now. The second thing is that Often people sort of tar NCS solutions sort of writ large with durability risks, but durability varies significantly across the landscape. And so I do think that's a major science question to help provide those maps of like, here are the places, yes, that are looking to be fairly risky under current and future climate solutions. So maybe we don't want to prioritize those places as much for investment. Here are the places where like forests have existed forever and will continue to exist forever. Those are the places where we probably do want to prioritize action. And then there's going to be a bunch of places in the middle that have some moderate risk profile. And it's about figuring out what are the management actions to mitigate those risks. You know, plant fire adapted species in patches and clumps instead of packing it full of trees. Build a sufficient buffer pool to account for reversals. So right now it's sort of concerns writ large about durability, I think, are impeding necessary action. And we need to move forward with the solutions we have at hand and then build the tools to help prioritize the places that are going to be places where we can manage risk appropriately.
Here, here. Well said, Bob.
I would just also add that you could speak, you know, I'm close friends with Christoph Gebel, the CEO of Climeworks, who is probably the biggest carbon capture and storage company in the world. And if you were to mention permanence to him, he would never say he's confident about the permanence of his you know, direct air carbon capture and storage. It's just as concerning. It shouldn't be stopping anyone from engaging in promoting nature.
And just the need for the both and. Like,
Yeah.
it's not engineered removal versus nature-based removal. It's both and. We
Exactly.
need them.
I love Climeworks too. Yeah, absolutely.
Here, 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 here. Couple of questions here that related to economy. One about for our corporate friends in the audience. What recommendations would you give to a company to have robust nature restoration and protection actions? What are some tools and strategies that a company could employ? Susan, maybe start with you.
Sure. I think, well, generally, the first thing to do is to look at yourself, right? Are there places where you can reduce emissions within your footprint and your own sphere of influence, first and foremost? But then investing in protection and restoration can provide incredibly valuable mitigation. And we're trying to build the tools that help you figure out where you can get the best returns per hectare, per dollar of investment. So we have a tool called naturebase.org that allows you to draw a polygon on a map, and it can show the types of activities that are the most promising for climate mitigation in that landscape. And so that could give you a sense of the places where you're working, what might the best options be. And then in general, I try to avoid telling people what to do because I'm not sitting in your chair, standing in your shoes, but really just trying to provide the tools. And I'd be happy to follow up with anyone and have conversations about like, what are you trying to maximize? What are your priorities? And then let us help you find the places where you can achieve those.
Great. And yeah, absolutely reiterating that opening point. If you can look in your own supply chain, obviously that's by far the biggest place to be making a difference. But on top of that, what I always say when considering how to invest in conservation or restoration or sustainable management initiatives is no one greenwashes their back garden. If instead of finding the big massive project that has, you know, if you're going to do a massive project and you want massive impact on a massive project, you have to make sure that is a long-standing project with decades of data and all the verifications and all the checks and all those things. And then you're essentially limiting what people can invest to maybe 100 or 200 projects around the world. And ultimately that isn't global restoration. Really what I would like to see people doing is moving towards finding the local, the bottom up. And that's why, you know, I mentioned Restore in my presentation. Restore is a tool that allows you to find any tiny local landowners, and you can build a portfolio of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 local landowners for whom there is no chance of greenwashing because they are, you know, they could be doing the wrong things. They might be getting it wrong, but these are from an ecological perspective. But as long as the landowner wants to be doing that action, my belief is that we should be distributing wealth to those people. So, because again, no one is trying to degrade their own land. If they're actively trying to promote biodiversity, the biodiversity that they depend on in that region, those are the people that we should be empowering. And those are the way that, and if you do that in a very transparent way, that is how we both lift people out of poverty. That is really the biggest driver of degradation on the globe, and collectively sort of start to tip the needle at a large spatial scale to have a real impact in a way that avoids the risks of greenwashing and all the threats that come with it, and the negative media and press that surrounds a lot of these activities. So yeah,
phenomenal. Thank you for that. We are running very close to time, so Alfonso, I'll just say, we can look to the 1T.org pledges for guidance on some of these corporate actions. Salesforce, Procter & Gamble, a number of different companies have adapted nature-positive strategies that are looking throughout their supply chains and their own business operations to really come up with a really, I think, a smart and strategic way of bringing a nature-positive approach to all their work. With that, I want to just share a little bit of information about 1T.org US before I offer my sincere thanks to our speakers. 1T.org US, as you know, is a partnership between the World Economic Forum and American Forests. We bring together companies, NGOs, and governments, all committed to conserving, restoring, and growing trees and forests throughout the United States. As part of our hope is that US plays a leadership role in that UN decade on ecosystem restoration, and that we show the way and lead by example on all the actions that our cross-sectoral coalition of companies, governments, and NGOs can do. We just released our impact report last week. Our pledges have conserved over 100,000 acres, have restored and are growing 1.3 billion trees. So we're headed in the right direction. We want more and more companies, governments, NGOs. If you aren't yet part of our 1T.org collaborative, join us. We want to count your success. We want to share information. We want to provide you access to sort of leading light scientists like Tom and Susan, so that we can translate that phenomenal science-based approach into that implementation on the ground. So I just leave you with a call to action to, if you're not a member of 1T.org US, please join us. And finally, huge thank you to Tom, to Susan. We are so lucky to have the intellectual firepower that we do, that's undergirding our movement, and I guess want you to know that we're your foot soldiers in getting these projects done on the ground. So thank you so much for providing that intellectual firepower and that intellectual sort of reason for existence for us to be here. So thank you all for joining us. We will have follow-up information coming up shortly, but huge applause to Tom and Susan, and thank you all for spending the time with us today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.